Hey, this is the Entertainment Advice Channel. What I want to talk about today is a topic of what was the best decade for movies, okay? So, when it comes to the golden age of movies, which was the 1950s to the 1990s, what was the greatest decade of them all is what I'll be talking about today, okay? So, now I mentioned that, let's get started. So, when it comes to what is the greatest decade, hands down, no ifs, ands, or buts, it was definitely the 1990s. Now, the reason why I say it was the 1990s is simply down to the fact that the 1990s had the best balance when it came to you know movies, okay, when it came to themes, okay, which is um upbeat and downbeat, okay. It had a perfect balance when it came to you know movies, okay, because the truth about the movies, okay, as I'm certain you're all aware, movies, when you watch them and they have a good guy who's fighting against a bad guy, and trying to do something and this and that. We all know unanimously the good guy always wins and things always work out in the end of the day. Okay, for the most part, for most movies. Okay, but sometimes things don't turn out the way you want them to. Okay, whether the bad guy actually wins. Or maybe the good guy wins, but it doesn't come out the way he expected it to, like he lost a really close friend or a lover, or he himself ended up dying. That's what you refer to as a more downbeat movie, okay? And that's the truth when it comes to movies, okay? Those are the two main types of movies, um, upbeat and downbeat, okay? At least that's what I mean by upbeat and downbeat in this context, okay? And the truth of the matter is, obviously, this is something filmmakers have been struggling forever, to figure out, how to make movies, um, turn out well, because you don't want movies to be too predictable, but also you want them to be satisfied with things actually turning out well. That is a huge struggle filmmakers have struggled, okay? Because people obviously want a happy ending, but at the same time, they don't want things to be too predictable. So the truth of the matter is, finding a balance is something that people have been struggling with for the longest time, and that is something that even filmmakers the film industry more like still struggles with to this very day, okay. And even though it hasn't truly ever been perfected, if there's one decade that came the closest to perfecting that, it was the 1990s, okay. There's a lot of good movies that came on that time period, that of course were upbeat, the character wins at the end of the day and everything turns well, but a sufficient amount of movies where things didn't turn out as great as you wanted them to turn out, okay. So even though of course what I mean by balance, if you haven't caught on, it doesn't necessarily have to mean necessarily 50-50, where 50% of the time things work out and 50% of the time things don't work out. Balance does not necessarily have to literally mean exactly like, okay, 50-50. It could be like 70-30% ratio. It could be 80%, 20% ratio. Like, it balance does not necessarily have to necessarily mean everything has to be exactly precisely 50-50. As you'd imagine, okay? Just like when you're making a recipe, okay? You need to balance the ingredients well together, but at the same time, you'll notice you'll probably put a bit more of a certain particular type of seasoning compared to another particular type of seasoning, okay? But it's still well balanced. So that's just an example of so that's just an example if you don't know what I mean by balance, because balance does not necessarily literally mean everything has to be 50-50, okay? And the truth is, back to what I was saying before about the 1990s being the most balanced decade, we haven't mastered how to have a good balance for that, but we definitely can say out of all the decades, it was definitely the best when it came to that balance, okay? Because the truth of the matter is, when you look at other decades, of movies going back in time, okay, like obviously like the 1980s or the 1970s, and all that type of stuff. The truth of the matter is, there definitely is a massive imbalance when it comes to those decades. Okay, the 1970s, it was too depressing. That's what I have actually heard. And when you look at the movies like The Taxi Driver, Dirty Harry, and all that type of stuff, the 1970s was just way, 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 way too depressing when it came to a lot of the movies that were released. Okay, it was just too sad and miserable, and a lot of things just didn't turn out well. It's just kind of depressing, if anything, And when people want to watch a movie, they want to hope that things turn out well because the 1970s was just too depressing. Well, the 1980s, for crying out loud, was just too optimistic. Everything always turned out well. Literally every movie, everybody had everything resolved. The bad guys lost, the good guys win. It was extremely fucking cliche, to the point that you can just look at a movie and say, okay, I already know everything's going to work out. And not just how everything's going to work out, I know it's going to turn out exactly this way, okay? That's the truth about those two previous decades, okay? And of course, going back to 1960s and 1950s, not unless you're interested in seeing movies in black and white and a world that's completely different from like today, obviously from when you're talking about the golden age, you're going to focus mainly on the 1970s, 1980s, and onwards, of course. Okay, that's the truth of the matter. So obviously the 1970s to the 1990s, specifically out of the golden age of movies, is what we're going to be focused on the most. Obviously, Common Sense 101, and the 1990s. When it came to those two worlds between optimism and negativity, was a balance. Okay, they had a lot of movies where things turned out well, but also had a lot of movies, you know, that things did not turn out well. Of course, the majority of movies, things turn out well in a very cliche way, but a lot of movies, at the same time, a minority, but still a lot of movies, things did not turn out the greatest, okay, for the characters, okay? So the truth of the matter is, that's what makes the 1990s the greatest decade of movies, okay? There's obviously other variables as well, but when it comes to my take on it, that's what makes it stand out from the crowd, okay? Compared to every other, of course, thing or argument people are going to make, okay? That is the honest truth of the matter when it comes to what makes the 1990s the greatest decade for movies, in all honesty. And obviously the 2000s and onwards, even though the 2000s was the better decade of the 21st century decades, the 2000s was just full of a lot of mashup, shoot 'em up movies, specifically thanks to people like Michael Bay, but so we can't include the 2000s in this list, but definitely the 1990s would definitely be included on this list because that's when it's the last decade when they focus on quality, okay? So that is the honest truth of why I believe that, when it comes to it being the greatest decade, Besides, the truth of the matter is you obviously want to have things positive, but at the same time, you don't want it to be too positive. Because when you make it too positive, then it just encourages countercultures where people say they want things to be dark. Oh my goodness, I hate people like that. The type of people, who just want to who say, oh, well, I just want to see things that are dark. And then it becomes a trend. And then all movies are just dark. And I'm certain, like, the vast majority of us logical people do not just want to see depressing movies where things are just depressing. Sometimes you want things to kind of uplift you, you know, and that's the reason why I say there needs to be a degree of darkness. We've seen this numerous times throughout history of entertainment, like music, for example, being a perfect example. The 1980s made music where they just talked about everybody being happy, everything going well. Then the 1990s, of course, was different because it was a different decade. And then it became cool for everything to be dark. And then it became too depressing. And then people got tired of that. And then they wanted things to be upbeat again, yada, 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 yada. Specifically, of course, grunge music, okay? Or I should say rock music. Definitely was guilty of that. That's honest truth here. Okay, so that's what I'm trying to get across here. You don't want that to happen. You don't want silly people to come out of woodwork and just want everything to be depressing because not everyone just wants to just hear about life sucks and this and that, And the reason why those people ever catch on, countercultures like that catch on, is when the main establishment are not able to give something for everybody. And obviously we don't live in a world where everyone just hears about everything sucking and this world sucks and this and that. Most logical people don't want to live in a world like that. So the best thing to do is to obviously prevent that from happening in the first place. And that's the truth about how you prevent countercultures from happening. and that's the reason why I think the 1990s was the greatest, because it had a better balance than any of the other decades for that matter. Okay, so that is the honest truth of why I believe the 1990s is the greatest decade for that matter when it comes to movies so far, at least. Okay, so that's the honest truth. Okay, so anyway, this is my video. This is off to say, if there's anything more to say, just to end this video off, when you create movies, for that matter, to put it bluntly, to be honest with you, what you need to do is you have to have a good balance, okay? Not just in terms of obviously predictability, but obviously, to make it, predictability so your movies don't become boring because they're too predictable, but obviously as well to obviously, of course, not make them too upbeat, or too depressing. Okay, you need to have a good balance between the two. Okay, that is the honest truth of the matter. Okay, and this is why I say the 1990s was the greatest decade, because it had the best balance, and not just that. That is something all film companies should strive for. Okay, having a good balance, because if you don't have a good balance, you're just gonna have chaos in one way or the other. Okay, that is honest truth, and that's all I have to say. And I hope you enjoyed this video. And simply put, I'm out. So bye.